Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. We'll wait a few moments for everyone to join and we will start in approximately 1 minute. Just while we wait, there is a handout that you can download while you're waiting. There we go. See quite a few people joining now. It's good. We'll give it an extra 10-15 seconds and then we'll get started. But welcome everyone. Fantastic. Let's get started. So thank you everyone for joining. My name is Sultan Hamawandi. I will be hosting this webinar today on FAIR for cyber risk quantification, evolution, not revolution. And today we are lucky to be joined by not one, but two special guests. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll allow them to introduce themselves. Jerry, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks Austin, appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be here and to listen. I'm Jerry Caponera, the VP of Cyber Risk Strategy at Threat Connect. I've been working in the cyber risk quantification field for a lot of years. I shaved the grays off this morning, but this is exciting to be here with my friend and somebody else who's been in this space a while as well too. You know, he's got not as many grays, I don't think, as I do.
I left him on.
Why don't you introduce yourself and your grays, Wade? Go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm Wade Baker. I'm a founder and partner at the Scientia Institute. Also teach cyber risk and cybersecurity courses for Virginia Tech in their business school. So I love this blend of business decision making and cybersecurity. And I'm glad to be back with my old friends and colleagues at Threat Connect. I'm a Threat Connect alum, so this is something that actually I have been looking forward to for a long time to see all this.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have you both on the line, and I'm really excited for the discussion. Just before we move on to the next slides, just want to give everyone a few housekeeping rules. So we do want to make this as interactive as possible, so please feel free to add comments as we go, questions as we go. We'll try and read as many of them out as possible. And then there'll also be a survey at the end. If you guys could take a minute or two just to answer that, we'd be super grateful for your feedback. We'd love to know what your thoughts were on today's session and any other topics you'd like to know about in future. So just send that in the feedback. And as mentioned, for those of you that joined early on, there is a handout in the handout section, which you're welcome to download. It tells you a little bit about Threat Connect and FAIR and automation, which is the topic that we'll be discussing today. So this session is being recorded. We will send it out in the coming days. And if you do have any other questions, either during or post the webinar, just let us know and we'll be happy to help. Perfect. So we'll now go on to a very quick introduction of both the organizations that are presenting today. Oh, there we go. Let's do the agenda first.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, do you want to go to the next slide, Jerry?
You got it. So, Saucin, I was trying to follow your flow on that one because I think you're right. We're going to go in introduction of Threat Connect and the Scientia Institute as well too, and then we're going to have our conversation about cyber risk quantification and FAIR. Lots to talk about. Saucin's going to do a great job of guiding us through this. I will tell you that we're committed to this cyber risk quantification and FAIR for the long run. So you'll be hearing more and more from Threat Connect about that, about our support for it, involvement in it. And we're really here to make it more actionable and easy to do. So that's the agenda, but that's just an agenda slide. So we'll kind of get into the meat of this in just a minute. I do want to explain who Threat Connect is because I'll take 30 seconds to a minute. And obviously Wade is an alumni, so he's heard this a little bit. But you know, with Threat Connect, it's really about how do you turn that conversation, how do you help security turn into what it needs to be from a business, an actionable business organization. By that we mean there's this concept we call risk, threat, and response, which is how do you link risk to a business, the threats that they're facing, and the ability or capacity to respond at speed and at scale for an enterprise organization to deal with the kinds of cyber risks and threats that they're dealing with today. So risk, threat, and response is the portfolio that we have here at Threat Connect. It also represents the individual products themselves, where we have our RQ product, which is focused on risk quantification. We have our threat intelligence platform built for TI teams. And we have our SOAR, which is really about orchestration and automation. So not only are the individual products, but they also work collectively together to really bring the power of risk threat response to our customers. Wade, this is you.
I'll take it away for the Scientia Institute. So we are a security data science and research firm. If you go to scientia.com/research, you'll see lots and lots of studies and reports that we've published over the last few years. And mostly what we do is take some kind of interesting security data set and we mine it and try to find things that are interesting and insightful and hopefully help people like yourselves manage risk in their organization. Specific to cyber risk, there's a few here that you might want to check out. The Information Risk Insight Study, or IRIS, as we affectionately like to call it, and if you see the I theme carried out through these, is all about measuring the frequency of cyber loss events and their impact and things like this. We recently released the Tsunami version of that report, which looks at really, really big multi-party or supply chain oriented security incidents and looks at how those go down. So check those out. Hopefully this kind of work is useful to you. And if you ever think, hey, I'd like to see that kind of stuff applied to my particular organization or sector, we do those kinds of analyses as well, and you can contact us and let us know. But we love studying this topic, so I'm glad to be here talking about it today.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Wade. Go ahead, Austin, it's all yours.
Perfect. So if we move on to the next slide, we can just dive straight in. So the first question is, what does cyber risk quantification currently look like? Who wants to kick this off?
I don't know, Wade, this is a fun conversation, right?
I think this might be a flattering view of what it looks like in many areas, to be honest.
Yeah, it's funny. I've had a lot of conversations over the last few months with organizations that are moving from that want to move from like a qualitative to quantitative, and the reason is they're moving from qualitative, you know, the stoplights and the red, yellow, greens to financial, is because the problem that they're trying to solve has nothing to do with the picture they see on the screen there. You know, most of the companies that we talk to are dealing with like the real world problems of, hey, you know what? My board keeps coming down and asking me these questions about, this is my favorite. I swear if I had a nickel for every time I heard this, I'd be owning the webinar platform. Let's just say that, where somebody on the board will read about something and they'll go, "Ooh, ransomware. What's the impact to this?" Or read about SolarWinds. What does this mean to us? How does this truly impact the business? And I think why the cyber risk quantification is becoming so big, and you don't have to believe us. You can track this. Gartner's talking about this. Forrester's talking about this. This is the big thing that's the big movement that's coming, is because the problems they're looking to solve are financial. They're dollar-based, and I don't see enough of that, and I don't see as much of that as I would like in the industry yet. So that's the kind of problems we're seeing, companies wanting to understand risk to themselves, but more importantly, know how to make decisions, actionable decisions that really drive, that are driven by finances and not by red, yellow, greens, and stoplights. That's what I'm seeing. Wade, I'm not sure about yourself.
Yeah, much the same. I mean, I got into this space actually. I was, I think, first year in my PhD program, and I was trying to figure out, all right, how does security, which is my interest, fit into this sort of managerial decision making and context. And I read a paper by Kevin Suhu. It was a Stanford research paper, and it was titled "How Much Security is Enough?" And I think it was like late 90s this paper was written, and it really, I read through this and it was like light bulbs went off. But you can't answer that question unless you quantify, right? I mean, like otherwise you just have, I guess, we've made this the appropriate shade of green to be enough, right? Or we've checked enough boxes off a list to be enough. But there's no real way to answer that in the context of the business. And I've seen a growing interest, Jerry, like you said. I think that has increased a lot over the years. But I have to say the capability to actually quantify risk and do it at scale, I would give it a positive slope over the years, but it's certainly not increasing as much as the growing interest and recognition that, hey, we need to do this. So I think we're kind of stuck in that phase currently of where we know we need to be and want to be, and where we can actually get to right now. But I'm optimistic, and I see signs of change, and I think that's changing. And we'll talk about some of that evolution, I think, as we go through this.
Yeah, I think
it's funny way to. Oh, go ahead, Sauce. I'm sorry.
I was going to say it'd be great to know from the audience, just while we're going through some of these questions and discussions, if you're not currently using cyber risk quantification today, what is holding you back and what's preventing you guys from actually, taking that approach? Do you still use, these heat maps? Are they working for you? And, what would make you take that next step to quantify cyber risk instead?
Yeah, I'd love to know that too. I think, Wade, what you were talking about when you described how you got into the space, it reminded me how I got into the space as well too. I came out of a pure cyber background, doing defense and research into threats, and then happened to stumble into this risk quantification world. But it fit because I always ran into trouble with convincing organizations to make the right business decision based on data and not based on political / the loudest person in the room asking for something. And trust me, that for those of you who know me, I'm an analytical person. That drives me batty. But I got one of the areas I started poking around in was cyber insurance, and it was really fascinating because when you talked about that lack of really understanding, people ask me all the time, "Oh, don't the insurance companies have this?" And my answer is no, they don't. And I think there's two things. I love these next two questions because they kind of tie together for me. Is why don't they have it? And how they don't have it because most of the financial risk that you deal with, we define cyber risk a little bit differently. We define cyber risk as the result of an attacker beating the defenses you have to cause that financial damage. There's a correlation in there, but cyber attack is built on a cyber actor, a cyber attacker executing those things. And I think that's the piece that's been missing. And it's also one of the things I think that's changing, the business factors that's changing, because I don't know if you track how well you track this as well too, Wade, but I'm seeing insurance companies, large underwriters like AXA Insurance, for example, changing what they will and won't pay for when it comes to ransomware attacks. I'm seeing AIG change how they look at underwriting, and there's gonna be a trickle down effect to the business from what we're seeing. And so your point about that is really spot on in my mind.
Yeah, I have seen some change. I talked to an insurer the other day, and it was a smaller one, but they won't insure businesses over a certain revenue, just because it's sort of the inflection point where cyber risk just becomes sort of untenable for what they're trying to do. So it's definitely starting to shape the market and premiums and all of those kinds of things.
So what do you think are the business factors that are changing how companies view cyber risk quantification?
Just a few thoughts on that. Pressure is one of them. I think that the more and more that security is overseen by executives in the organization and ultimately the board, the more pressure there is to demonstrate that risk is being managed well. And in order to demonstrate that, you need to speak their language. So I think that is helping kind of push that from the top. Like Jerry mentioned, I think threats and the growing issues of things like ransomware is also another one of those. I have long hoped that, I hate to say this, that it would get so bad that the insurers would begin to put pressure on organizations to do things that actually reduce risk, right? Well, first we got to figure out what those are, and then we've got to do them and incentivize companies to do them. And you can kind of see that in the air today, that those things are developing. I think that are all moving people toward this cyber risk quantification.
Yeah, you need to nail it. The one thing I'll add, which I'm watching more and more, is, believe it or not, the government's eventually going to start dropping the hammer on people. I watched it years ago. I think 3 or 4 years ago, the SEC came out and said public companies should report on material risks related to cyber, and they use fuzzy words. Should, materials a little bit. Yeah. I love government. I hope if you're a lawyer on the phone, we love you, but we're analytical people. We like clearer language. But I saw that, and I'm seeing more of this. The SEC fined a company over the summer for vulnerabilities that they had leading to breaches. So you're seeing, and we've seen movements like GDPR in the EU, California with their own data protection laws, New York State with them. I think the business factors are changing, is that businesses are realizing, hey, this is coming. This is not just the tech guys telling us this. This is not just a finance, but there's going to be a government regulation that comes about this. And the stats I just read from Gartner the other day said something like 60% of boards by 2025 will have dedicated cyber risk, measurements or maturities related. So it's coming. The business factors are growing, and I don't think they're going to stop.
Yeah, I know you just asked a question of the audience there a little while ago, Saucin, but I'd be interested if anyone, what was it that brought cyber risk quantification to your attention in the organization? Was it someone that said, hey, we need to do this? Was it, what prompted you to be here today? Kind of a question. So we'll see what we get there.
Absolutely, yeah. So don't be shy. Please feel free to comment and send some in. We'll try and read a few of them out as we go along. We've had some come in, and that we'll get to those. So please do be involved in this session. So we've talked a little bit about cyber risk quantification, and FAIR is a big movement as part of that. Is that the right place to start? What are you guys finding from that perspective?
I have been familiar with FAIR for for quite some time. Back when I was working on the Verizon data breach investigations report, I met and started working with Alex Hutton, who worked with Jack Jones in bringing FAIR in the early days of development. And so I got to know it fairly early on, and have always found it quite useful in terms of categorizing things. Jerry's mentioned several times now that he's an analytical person, I'm an analytical person, and things just make more sense to me when they're organized well. And I think FAIR has done a good job of, saying, okay, what is cyber risk? What are the components? There's loss event frequency, there's loss magnitude, and if we break down loss event frequency, what's under there, getting to things that we can assess and think about when we're trying to do cyber risk assessment and quantification. And I think that's been a big contribution in terms of coalescing that language in the community and letting it grow like it has over the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think we're all here because of what FAIR has done in terms of building awareness that cyber risk is a real thing, and it is something you can communicate, and it is something you can work off of. Absolutely, think it's kind of one of those building blocks that has helped the industry really enable this conversation in the first place. I like the question though, because is it the right place to start? I'd actually argue the place to start whenever you're thinking about risk quantification is that first question, which is, what problem do you want to solve? I can't tell you how many times I get on and I start talking to people, friends, colleagues, whoever, and the ability to articulate the problem or need you have is the number one thing. Talking to folks who are doing qualitative risk, and they were saying, well, I really want to be able to show people that this one control we have in place matters to risk, and then you kind of pull it out. Why? Well, because this person runs that program and it's important to them. I'm like, yeah, but that's not cyber risk. Like, we have to. I think what FAIR has helped do is standardize what some of those things are, but it comes back to what are the problems, and we have to start with the problem, because sometimes the problems, FAIR is a tool in a tool set, but the problems we have to solve are the things we have to stay focused on. And if we don't, we get lost in the wrong kind of weed. I love the weeds. I hate the weeds in the yard, but you gotta focus on the right weeds. I'm looking at my yard's right out there, so I'm a little bit obsessed about it.
No, absolutely. I think, Jerry, what you've just touched upon is starting to draw upon the comparisons between a control-based security program and a risk-based security program. I'm sure we'll be diving deeper into that anyway during this discussion. But just quickly before we move on to the next question, I'm going to read out some of the comments. One of them, Wade, I think you're going to be really excited by. So this one's more of a comment than a question. This one says, there was no risk management program, and the CISO, who was a follower of Wade Baker, chose to implement FAIR. So, that's a great piece of recognition. I think that definitely deserves applause. So, no, that's fantastic. It would be great to know how that's going for you. Do let us know. And then the other person says, I'm taking next steps for cyber risk quantification independently of our ERM function. That's quite interesting in itself, actually. Need for decision makers to approve, deny funding for mitigation. So I think that's something that we can talk about as well as we move on to some of the following questions. But again, it's really that approach that companies are shifting from that compliance and control based security program towards that risk based. So no, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that last comment there is one where I think could give some more momentum behind cyber risk quantification. If it's useful in proving out a need for various investments in security, that would be a big benefit, because it's hard to do, especially depending on what type of organization you're in. That can be a really difficult justification to make, and if CRQ can help make that easier or more convincing, then that's awesome.
Yeah, and another thing that we typically encourage is that sometimes cyber risk is treated as a separate little function in the corner, but it really should be part of the overall enterprise risk management strategy, because it can affect businesses, and we do rely so much on digital programs and digital solutions now that it can't be something that's siloed off. It is part of the bigger picture. So it's interesting that it's not done with your ERM team. Maybe that's something that you should definitely consider. There might be a lot of overlap there. So no, great comments, great questions. Please do keep them coming. If we move on to the next question. Thank you. So we did touch upon FAIR in that previous discussion, but it's well known, but it's not as well operationalized as it should be. So it'd be great to talk about why that is. So we've broken out some questions that will really help us discuss this question in further depth. The first one is the speed versus scale. How do you get something like this up and running without hindering your overall objectives too? Is it something that you should start small and expand out slowly? What are your thoughts on this?
So Austin, you're going to have to do a good job of corralling us and not letting us talk for days about this in the next section, because this is a fun conversation now. So I'm going to be like a broken record and say that I think one of the biggest things we need to do is make sure we're working on solving the problems that are most needed. One of the many things I see when people are thinking about starting down the cyber risk quantification route is they try and go, I have the ocean and I have a match. I can boil this in time. And I promise you can't. The other thing I've heard, so I get a lot of bad analogies, you guys. Sorry. I'm not sorry, I love my bad jokes. Anyway, so there's that, and then there's also the perfect is the enemy of good enough, right? I was on listening to somebody at Verizon talk about this yesterday, and he had a better quote than that. I should have remembered it. Speed versus scale are not independent. They're not different. right? What we really want to think about is what do we want to focus on from a risk perspective. I think one of the challenges with operationalizing FAIR, I was listening to a webinar last week, and they described their whole process they went through. You know, in the last 10% of the process was using an internally built FAIR tool to quantify risk, but the process itself was long. And the process itself was long because 90% of the time they ended up spending gathering data, talking to people, working with different kinds of organizations, you know, stakeholders in the organization. That immediately negates speed and scale. And it also, let's be honest, attackers aren't going to wait for you to have 18 different conversations. So I think one of the reasons, you know, I was excited when Wade said he would join here is because I think one of the biggest things we, as an industry, as a cyber risk quantification industry, need to focus on is to be data driven, to make this a data conversation that is good, not fair, not better, good. Sorry, I have to use a bad analogy there. But if we use data to drive decisions and modeling, and this is kind of what Wade's forte is, we can get speed and scale, because that is actually what we're after. It's not one or the other, it's both. And I like how we have the balance there. Anyway, I'll shut up because I can talk about this one for days, but Wade, I'll ask if you have anything sensical to add to my nonsense.
I rarely have anything sensical to add to anything. Sometimes the nonsense is all right though. You know, on this speed versus scale thing, it's one of the areas, you know, that at least I have struggled as I've tried to implement FAIR and other things like that. You know, I don't think it was designed for speed, though, to be quite honest. You know, I think when you just look at how FAIR is laid out and all the things that you need to assess and the way that you need to assess those and how people need to be calibrated in order to give reasonable estimates of things like probability of action and all of that, you know, it's not designed to be like, oh, we just quantified risk. You know, it's meant to be a thought process to facilitate discussions, to go and really study a scenario. And you know, it works well for that, but of course, that's the scale problem, right? That doesn't scale very well because we have probably most organizations have more scenarios that they need to assess than you can reasonably do with the resources and time that you have, and that's where I see a lot of people struggling, again, including myself, and that's where I am a firm believer that data can push us through the process and maybe eliminate some of the scenarios that we have decent data on that we can go ahead and make a decision. And then the things where there's uncertainty and we're not really sure, that's where we can dig in with FAIR and take more time to do that assessment and come to a decision. So yeah, and I think we could say more about that, but I'll kick it back over to the audience again, because it's one of those areas where, you know, where has it gone off the tracks as you've tried to do these kinds of assessments. You know, they're roadblocks, problem areas where you get hung up, that kind of thing. If you have some, throw them in, and we'll see if it resonates with others.
So Jerry, from your perspective, why do you think it takes so long? You know, I mean, feel free to use any of your analogies. I love them. Come in. We could do a poll at the end for your favorite analogy. If
Best analogy.
Best worst analogy. I got a couple of them up my sleeve. You know, I got my start doing this in the CRQ world when Doug Hubbard wrote his first book, How to Quantify Anything in Cyber, How to Quantify Anything. Then he and Rich Shearson wrote the second book, How to Quantify Anything. They added the cybersecurity part. Love Rich, love what he's doing, being metrics driven. I think one of the challenges, though, in why it is a long process is because there's a people believe they know more than they do, and people believe they need more information than they think they do. Right? There is a lot of data. I've actually never heard anybody say they don't have enough data. That's not something I typically hear. Typically, if you talk to any organization, they say I have a lot of data. What they don't have is a lot of great ways to organize and to pull it in. You know, our whole philosophy and kind of what drives us internally is, here's an analogy for you. You know, we eventually, let's use Tesla, one of my favorite companies to watch, right? Tesla has full automation capabilities for driving cars. Not everybody's going to use it. I will sign up day one because I can't stand traffic. So there is a full automation capability. They also have adaptive cruise control, and then they have drive your own car. So there's multiple different options for people to go and execute things. And what you really find when you're doing either driving the car yourself, using adaptive cruise control, or fully automation in the car is you get the ability to choose what do you want to focus on. And so I think what Wade said was right. Do you want to dive deep into something, or do you want to be able to go at speed and use that time that you would be spending going deep on something that's arguably more valuable? I say more valuable because one of the questions that we have and we're trying to work through, and again, I'd love to know more from the audience here, is if you've never had material cyber breaches in your organization. I was talking to somebody just the other day. They said, we've never had a really big loss. How do we get the numbers? I don't care how long you take. You're not going to get good input for that. So that is part of the challenge, is recognizing what you're really good at and where you have the information for, and then going, maybe I should be turning it over to the either adaptive cruise control or full automation. I think part of it, Sausan, is recognition of what you really have, what you as a business are focused on, and what can you bring to the conversation. Because most people don't spend their days, nights, and weekends thinking about this specific problem. And so that's where I think folks like what Wade and crew do with the data they've got and what others like ourselves doing help that along. Again, good question. I'll give you another analogy at least. So.
What can we talk about your next one?
I'll just offer, a target to aim at, maybe, if it sounds reasonable. But I think that an organization probably needs a full, fair assessment, maybe 5%, maybe at most 10% of the risk scenarios that are on their radar. And I'm curious if anybody has quantified this, but that's my sense is there's probably just a small number of them that really need that full treatment, and the rest should be sort of ranked and stacked using data and done quickly and at scale, so that you can put them in their right place, deal with them like you need to, but then spend resources on the few. And that's boils down to what Jerry was saying, but that's my sense, is about 5%, maybe 10%. Would love to hear if anybody has sort of looked at that, but might be something to shoot for as you try to navigate where to apply FAIR and where to use data and other sorts of mechanisms to get you where you need to be.
I love that. I want to add one thing to that, because I think you said something really, I couldn't agree more. And one of the things that I'm seeing more of is people starting, if they start with FAIR, you have to start knowing what risks. You start with an assumption. Right. The reason we keep talking about data, the reason we keep saying being analytical, is because when you say, I want to start with an assessment, you've made an assumption, you know where to start. And so, Sausan, you asked the question early on in this thing, or early on in this section here. I think the place to start is to get as broad a view of your risk as you can, and then start going down in layers. Because if you start narrowly, like in that 5 to 10%, you could end up starting in the wrong place in terms of what matters most to your business. So when we tell people to start, we tell them to start simply and then incrementally grow and make it deeper. And because every single time I've ever had a conversation about cyber risk quantification with somebody, we start on one thing and end up somewhere else because they went, oh, this is what I actually need to be worried about. So that's another way to handle speed versus scale, is to do that incremental approach. Don't try and boil the ocean with the match. I promise you it won't work.
So I think that leads us on quite nicely to the last question here, as part of this overall theme, is what do you actually get from that effort? And we don't want to preach to the choir here, but it would be just good to touch upon some of the main benefits.
Main benefits. Well, I'll be briefer on this one. I don't have a good analogy for this. I can think of one though. Challenge accepted. Sorry. I think if that was a bad joke, by the way, for those who got it. I think the biggest thing is there's a couple things that people get out of this. One is they at least get awareness, right? When you run through a FAIR assessment, you get awareness of potential risk on a probabilistic scale. Now, that's math words, and Wade knows the math better than I do. It's challenging for people to understand that kind of information, but you at least get awareness, you at least get a sense of risk, what your risk is, so you can start to set an appetite that you can accept. I think one of the challenges, though, is that's typically where this ends, and it's not the what do I do about it. You know, we preach that you need to understand what risk is, you need to figure out what you can transfer to the insurance and others, and then you need to act on it, mitigate it. And I think what people get out of these efforts, again, it goes back to the business problem, but I think what's missing, and has been missing, is how do you do something tangibly with the results beyond creating awareness and understanding?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, someone's put in the comment section the amount of time and energy into educating the right people on the methodology is a huge challenge. So I think what this person is saying is just gaining buy-in. It can be quite difficult. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know if you necessarily need to convince people or train people on the methodology. I think they just need to know what they're going to get and understand how you came to those conclusions. But Wade, Jerry, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that comment that came in from the audience.
You know, I've heard similar. You know, there is training certainly involved in order to do a fair assessment well. You know, and I think, to go back to what you get out of that, it's a good methodology for walking through a risk scenario and assessing it. You know, if someone says, hey, what if this could happen to us, and you don't really have any data on that, and you know, people in the business are worried about it, it's a great way to give an answer that is well founded, well thought out, and you know, uses quantitative approaches instead of like, gee, that'd be terrible if that happened, wouldn't it? You know, that kind of stuff. So it's a whole lot better than that.
Yeah, I agree, Wade. I think, you know, we don't want high, medium, we don't want heat maps anymore. I think the one thing we probably do poorly is we talk about the how we do things too often, and not the why and the value. And that might be a way that, you know, something, again, this is a very, but I think this is part of the groundswell for how CRQ has come about. It's come about from a very mathematical, analytical perspective, and that's what we did. I think most business people just want to take the information and make decisions. And so maybe part of the challenge, or part of the action we could take out of this, is to focus on the outputs and less on the how we get there. I don't know. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I agree with your answer. It just got me thinking as well too.
Lovely. Well, keep the comments and questions coming in. We can move on to the next question, which is, how can data help improve subjectivity and speed up time to value? Brilliant. So most companies are running fair analysis. They use internal data, but it's also important to consider the external data as well. So I don't know, Wade, do you want to kick this one off?
Certainly. Again, I've been studying this a long time, and maybe chasing this dream is a better way to put it, because I mentioned the Verizon data breach report. Honestly, that started off years ago for the purpose of getting data to support risk assessments. I mean, that's why we started doing that. We said, hey, you know, people that respond to incidents, seems like they ought to have some useful information that we could use for cyber risk assessments. Let's see what we can learn. And then it kind of became its own animal and its own report over the years, and that kind of thing. But the fundamental reason we did that is because it seemed like good data. And you know, the things we've been doing lately at the Scientia Institute is a lot of that as well, trying to take historic incidents and learn what we can from them. And hey, what is the frequency of these kinds of things occurring? When that happens, what does the loss distribution look like? You know, there's a lot we can learn from external data that has happened to other organizations that can help us when it comes to assessing risk. And I'll be honest, I know this question is phrased on internal data, but I suspect that maybe more organizations use external data for assessing cyber risk than their own internal data, which seems crazy. But for some reason, I've seen a lot of hesitation to use internal data for this purpose, or just sort of like, I don't know what internal data is useful for this. But that's another one I'll pose to the audience of, when you look at the data that is being used to drive cyber risk quantification, is it what's the balance between internal data and external data? I don't know, Jerry, you got any thoughts on that?
I love the comments. It's a great question, and you're right. There is no right answer. I'm a home improvement junkie. I am. It's what I love to do. If I'm not, working on this, I'm working in my shop, and so I spend a lot of time. I kind of go down to Home Depot, and they're like, "Oh, you're back. Nice to see you again." I say that because they got breached a number of years ago. And I remember thinking about that and talking to people and going, "Well, wonder if that's the risk to Lowe's." Right? We talk about internal versus external data. I'm sure the folks at Lowe's were like, not the hotel guys, the other home improvement guys, going, "Well, that happened to Home Depot. How does this relate to us?" And the answer is, I think the part of the challenge when you think about fair or risk quantification is you have to think about how Home Depot had a set of defenses and internal configurations that could have been very different than Lowe's. One could have been Microsoft, one could have been running Apple. And so I think you're right, Wade. I'm seeing people use a little bit of both internal and external. The struggle they run into on internal tends to be knowing who to talk to on the business side, because most of the security teams, most of the risk teams don't know who to talk to in business or understand the business value well, unless they've done like a business impact analysis. And external data, it's a little bit, external data is good, but it needs to be worked on. Let's just say that, right? It needs to be cleansed and run through modeling and cleanup. So I think part of this challenge of the data really boils down to understanding what am I really dealing with? And that's why Home Depot and Lowe's is always stuck in my head, because just because Home Depot got breached doesn't mean that the financial risk for Lowe's is identical or even close, because there's so many other variables that run into the equation. I want to see people drive this conversation to data, but I love the data pyramid, right? Because it needs to be refined into information and knowledge before you can derive wisdom from it. So it's not just a pure data conversation. It's actually, in my opinion, much broader than that.
Fantastic. And I think we've covered off how much is enough data, and the answer to that is you can never have too much. But we'll move on to the next one just for the benefit of time. But do people use details in FAIR or LEF, and why is that? Does it cause confusion in terms of operationalizing FAIR?
This is an area where I've kind of experimented a lot over the years, and what I will say and has worked for our research may or may not sync with what you're doing. But a lot of times when we gather data, we're looking at again, historical incidents and the information that we have about the losses associated with those incidents. So we're really operating at the first tier of FAIR, where you have loss event frequency and loss magnitude, because we are trying to quickly take the spectrum of things that are out there and distill them down to where you have a sense of a handful of incidents or threat categories that you ought to pay attention to, based on the assumption that your organization is at least somewhat like its peers or other things like that. And I think operating at that level is an excellent way to do that, because that's kind of what you need to know. You need to know loss event frequency and loss magnitude, and you can do a loss exceedance curve or an EP curve, as some call it, if you want to get a sense of what might I stand to lose over some given time frame for ransomware versus system intrusions versus lost laptops and stuff like that, right? It'll bubble up things that are common, and it's good for that. Now, when you need to go, like listed here, are threat capability and resistance strength. That's down toward the bottom of the FAIR tier. And I think they're harder to assess. When you think of something like threat capability, how do you measure that? You know, there's a lot of intelligence out there about the capability of different threat actors. You can take, you know, Fancy Spider or whatever, and, you know, in Threat Connect, they have a lot of great information about what the types of targets they're known to attack, and their tactics, techniques, and procedures that they use, and other things. But it takes a lot of work, you know, especially if you have to do that at a lot of different times and for a lot of different scenarios. So, you know, I do think people use the details, the bottom rung details of FAIR, but I think they use them in isolated scenarios. At least that's the way I use them. Again, I start from the top, sort 90 to 95% of things with basic loss event frequency and loss magnitude. And then for what's remaining, where you don't have information, or you really don't feel that information is good enough to make the decision that you need to make, then you move down the tree and do what you can to either gather data or subjectively assess those things if there's just not any data at all. Hopefully that sheds some light on on the way, you know, you can kind of bounce up and down and throughout the FAIR framework.
If we then focus specifically on vulnerability data, then is that something that you feel that we have a good understanding of at the moment, or organizations have a good understanding of?
That is a good one, because vulnerability is an area in FAIR, and it sort of breaks down into threat capability and resistance strength. And vulnerability information is probably one of the longest measured things in security. But of course, it's not just measuring, hey, how many vulnerabilities were published on the CVE list last year, right? That's probably not going to help you do a risk assessment. But maybe things like, I think we have a chart queued up from some research that Scientia has done in collaboration with Kenna Security over the last few years. Can you pull that up? Or I think, yeah. You know, this is an example of something that I think informs a risk assessment or decision. And because we all often wonder, you know, here's this vulnerability, should we patch it now, or can we wait a little bit for our normal patch cycle, right? And one of the things that makes a huge difference in that is whether or not an exploit exists. And if you tie that back to FAIR, when an exploit exists, the capability of the threat actor is higher, because when an exploit exists, that gets rolled into proof of concept, that gets wrapped into tools like Metasploit and other things, and you go from a threat actor that has to have an intimate, very sophisticated knowledge of a vulnerability and how to exploit it, to a threat actor that can just push buttons and launch an automated attack at scale across the internet and find your server that's on the internet. So it's just two different things. And that's kind of what this chart is getting at, you know, relative to when a patch is available, what is the timing of the first known exploitation? And you can see the patch available vertical thing there. And as it, you know, about 11% of exploitations happen before the patch is available. This is just looking at a huge number of CVEs. Every CVE vulnerability would follow a different curve, but just in general, there's a little bit sometimes of exploitation activity available before the patch is available. Then the patch becomes available and exploitation activity starts increasing. But you know, we've seen 44% of exploitations within a month of the patch being available. So that kind of tells you, like, if you are an organization that's going to be among the first targeted, right? Are you a highly targeted target of choice? Then you don't have much time to get that patch deployed, right? Whereas if you're not, and you're kind of a target of opportunity, you've probably got a little while, which can inform a risk-based decision, you know, when you're assessing threat capability and other things like that.
I think when you see it visually like that, it really does show how important it is just to take this risk-based vulnerability patching approach. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Certainly.
I'm going to read out a few of the comments because we've got quite a few rolling in, so you are definitely getting people thinking now. Someone says, I like the approach to start with external as a starting point and then narrowing it down my estimated range using internal data. So that's a good one. Someone else said they prefer external data because it's a larger sample size. So, you know, that's good as well. Someone else, yeah, it aids time to value and gives us help with collaboration efforts. And someone else says, I prefer operating at the higher factors in the model LEF, LM, then to TEF and then vulnerability, but not further down.
Interesting. I always really do enjoy hearing how people are using it, because and that's one of the strengths, I think, of a framework like FAIR. You can operate at different levels depending on what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, if we move on to the next slide, I think there are some really good questions here. And it's really focused around, well, automation. Is it possible? Can it be done? So let's see what the discussion topics are here. So firstly, how can automation help with quantifying risk? Is this something you want to take, Jerry?
Yeah, it's funny, just listening to that conversation that you guys were having about vulnerabilities and threat event frequency, and I think you're absolutely right, Wade. Loss event frequency is at the macro level is definitely something we can, you know, can use as an estimation, subject matter estimation well. I think where automation can help when it comes to quantifying cyber risk is in terms of figuring out that threat landscape and computing the vulnerability as FAIR defines this. Because it is not something I'd argue people can effectively get a good picture on in an individual scenario perspective. I think that's just been a struggle. So I think automation can be applied to parts of FAIR, like the lower levels in the you know, in the taxonomy on the left-hand side, and some of the magnitudes as well too, to provide guidance on that. And again, that automation doesn't have to be the answer, right? I mean, automation is important because it reduces manual efforts, but it still, at the end of the day, gives you, the end users, the ability to act and to change and to choose. And that's important because, you know, everybody I've ever talked to this over the years knows that their cyber risk is theirs alone. It's a little bit different from everybody, so it's kind of interesting, but definitely automation. Go ahead.
Yeah, so actually cyber risk, you know, it is unique to every organization, and I think that does prompt a lot of questions around customization. Is that possible with automation? You know, because every business is unique, every business has their own special threats and risks that they need to account for. So how do you think that works?
So I'll take this and I'll hand it over to Wade, but I think I'll go back to my Home Depot and Lowe's example. Home Depot is not a unicorn. They're not a special unicorn. They might be a unicorn. They might find a unicorn valuation wise. That's not the kind of unicorn I'm talking about. You know, most companies work with people, similar technologies and similar processes to manage IT and security inside an organization. Some are better than others. A friend of mine, you know, ran security for a large company. He said, we built great perimeters, but once you're in, moved everywhere. Talked to other people, they went, oh, you know, we defend the servers and forget everything else on the outside, as a simplistic example. So there is special, you know, they are special, but at the end of the day, they're still using a lot of the same items. And this goes back to that speed versus scale question of, can you get somebody 80 to 90% out of the, you know, very rapidly with automation, with the data from the organization, getting into that 80 or 90% effective and you know, accurate number. And then the question boils down to is, how much value do you get out of going that last 10, 15, 20%? How much does it change? You know, if your numbers change by fractions, does that really matter in the grand scheme of things? And that's a good debate to have mathematically, and it's an important conversation to have from a business perspective. But most companies I deal with aren't as special as they think they are. And I think the data that we're seeing and some of the stuff that Wade does and some of the data that we show kind of shows that you're you know, sorry, you're not a unicorn. You're just not a unicorn, and that's a good thing in a lot of ways as well too. But anyway, I'll stop, Wade, because this is a fun conversation.
Yeah. It is, and I will take a kind of a wider view of automation here and address some of that last question too about risk factors that lend themselves best to automation. So, you know, you can do the kind of automation. I would argue that it's automation, if you expand the definition, of what I was talking about and operating at the top layer of the tree in the FAIR model with loss event frequency and loss magnitude. There's enough data out there to automate an assessment for your sector or for your sector in size, your peer group, of the top threat scenarios that most organizations like you are experiencing, and you can get a frequency assessment for that, of course, within a distribution, and a distribution and some parameters for loss magnitude. And that can be sufficiently automated to where you can get some starting points and some answers quick and truck you off down the road toward cyber risk quantification. So that's one type. And then on the bottom of the tree, I do think there's another type of automation. I'll go back to vulnerabilities and threat capability and resistance strength and that world of the FAIR framework. Because this is something that I know Threat Connect is doing. I'll do, when I was there, I was very interested in, hey, I want to assess whether or not this particular threat actor or this type of threat actor represents a danger to my organization. And one way you can do that is take the vulnerabilities that you have in your organization, which is automated with scan tools. All of that information is loaded up. You can layer that with information that, say, would reside in Threat Connect about which adversaries are known to exploit those vulnerabilities. And in at least a semi-automated way, you can kind of get a sense of threat capability and resistance strength to those in an automated way. And you could even begin automating remediation and of those vulnerabilities and other things like that. So I think automation applies at the top and the very high level stuff, mostly with data, and then also at the bottom when we start talking about doing those assessments, taking in what I know about my environment, and taking actions. Oh, I need to start monitoring these vulnerabilities in my SIM. I need to pass them over to the VM team to start remediating, because now I know that an adversary can exploit that, and they've targeted organizations like us in the past, and it's now has a known exploit that's released. We got to do something. Let's get going. So I think there's a lot of promise in automation and various levels of risk assessment.
Agreed.
Fantastic. Well, there's just, if we quickly go on to the next slide, we'll just talk through the three key takeaways, because there are a few questions that are coming in, but I think we'll save them now until we get to the end. So Jerry, do you want to quickly summarize these three takeaways, and we can get on to some questions?
I think both Wade and I have talked about how we've been in this industry for a little while. He has more visible gray because I shaved this morning and he didn't. But we've both been watching and tracking this from different but related perspectives. It is here to stay. Gartner's got it on top of the hype cycle. We're seeing that businesses are needing to do this. Hope is not a strategy. So please, this is the time to start thinking about and acting on this. As Wade mentioned, there's a lot of data out there. In fact, he didn't do this, but I will do this for him. I'm a big fan of what they do. I think you've got a webinar coming up on sometime later this week as well too, Wade, where you're going to talk more about this stuff. I suggest you guys go and listen. It's great.
Dude, tomorrow. Thanks. Yeah.
Oh yeah, tomorrow. Sorry, I don't know what day it is. Apologies. That's good. CRQ is so busy. I know. And then I think the automation piece we just talked about. You can automate. I love the car analogies because everybody gets cars, right? When Henry Ford, built, what built Ford and what it was into, he didn't necessarily build the most incredible car. What he figured out was how to automate the process of doing something at scale and at speed. And I think that's the trick we have to start thinking about for CRQ to be adopted and for you to get valuable information out of it. We really have to automate. And as Wade talked about and I've talked about, you can automate at a lot of different levels. We've seen it. We're doing it. It is something you can and should do, and don't think you can do it all yourself. It's a heavy lift. So
beautiful, beautiful. Well, if you would like to see all of this in action as well, the automation side of things, we do have Threat Connect are hosting a session on this as well. I understand it says on the 11th of November. That's actually 23rd. But what we'll do is we'll circulate the links via email. So anyone that's attended this will receive an invite to our live demonstration of Risk Quantifier 6.0, which we actually launched last week, which was very, very exciting. And we're going to talk about how we can, well, we'll show you automation of FAIR within that session. And if you want to know more, you can also download the handouts as well that I mentioned. That talks a little bit about Threat Connect and how we help with FAIR. There's a few questions here that I'd like us to quickly run over. So if you do have a few moments, please do stay on the line. These are really good questions. So someone says, why do you say heat maps are no good? Isn't that the alternative to where we don't have time or resources for full FAIR? I think that's a very good question, actually.
It is a good question, and I think some of the hate of heat maps in the risk quantification community is not that a heat map is bad. In other words, I could produce a heat map based on actual frequency and loss measurements that I take. I think the bad name and sort of that when you hear them disparaged in these contexts, it's more about a qualitative, purely qualitative approach to cyber risk management that often results in a heat map. But the heat map is not based on data. It's not based on any quantitative method. It's based on, I think frequency is low and impact is high, and therefore risk is semi-high, and I'm going to do that orange. That kind of approach that has been shown to be not helpful and in some cases inaccurate is where you hear that. And I will admit that it's probably an overcorrection, because heat maps are a fine tool when the data under them is not made up.
Well said. Well said. I can make a great bad joke on it, but we're over time, and I think I'll. I have 4 kids. Which one's going to break something next? We have stitches and bones being broken all the time. I could make that up, or I could use data. Wade, you said it perfectly. It's about the underlying assumptions that go into it versus the delivery mechanism.
Brilliant. Well, have you ever seen a CISO not pursue an expenditure based on a quantitative analysis that shows it was probably little or negative ROI? In general terms, have you seen the results of CRQ analysis change a decision maker's decision? Very wordy question, but great nevertheless.
100%. 100%. And that's been the most fun. I'll be brief so you can add on to this as well too, Wade. We're working with a customer, and their struggle was, I'll give you a specific example without using the names to protect the guilty or innocent. But what they were dealing with is this challenge where the business would come to them and say, look, we can't meet your security requirements in time to launch the new feature, new product, and put the new application online. Give us a waiver, just let us do this. And typically what happened was security would get rolled, right? Typically get rolled over. Business needs this. Why did business would ask security why? And security would go on this really elaborate conversation. They go, well, because long story short, the security got rolled, business got what they wanted. I watched an organization, security organization, turn from no, you can't do this, to yes with an if. So the next time that happened with the business, business came in and said, hey, we need this waiver, grant us this, let us do this. They said, security said, you can do this if you accept this risk. And they showed them a financial number with the risk. And the business went, whoa, hang on a second, we can't do that. And it fundamentally changed the relationship between security and the business. And I remember them telling me about this, and I'm going, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in that room, because that's the goal is not to be like, ooh, sky is falling, horrible things. The goal is to answer that question that was asked exactly in terms of, oh, I lost something. I don't know what I'm showing anymore. The goal is to answer that question, and I have seen it, which is absolutely awesome. I love that. Stop sharing because I don't know what I'm sharing anymore. Did we lose Austin? We lost Austin, didn't we?
No.
There she is.
You need the lights. Sorry.
We answered the question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Wade, from your perspective as well, have you seen CISOs make U-turns, or boards make U-turns based on data that they've been able to produce through CRQ?
I have, and where I thought the question was going, I'll take that just in case others out there are interested, because I think Jerry gave an example of that. But so yes, I have seen that. But I thought the question was, has a CISO taken a sort of low estimate and changed away from doing something like that? And I think people perceive that as they're almost concerned to quantify risk because it might be too low and undermine their efforts that, hey, we need more and more and more money. And I've heard that expressed as a concern, and kind of seen that reaction to, hey, here's our assessment of this risk. Gee, that's a lot lower than I thought it was. And maybe the assessment is wrong, in which case you can tweak parameters based on updated information or assumptions. But I think that's a good thing. Like, I think we earn support in the business and the boardroom when we can actually say that not all security things are like end of the world stuff, right? Like if we can kind of say, yep, that's an issue, but it's smaller than we thought, we're going to turn our attention to this thing over here because it seems to be a lot bigger than we thought. You buy a lot of credibility, and I think that's one of the things where I hope CRQ will turn us away from the things that Twitter blows up about to the things that actually matter for risk to our organizations.
So I love that. I love where you took it as far as sauce, because I think you're right. I've seen that as well too. And I think that's part of the elasticity of CRQ being adopted right now, is because there's a perception problem, right? We perceive a risk should be X and it turns out to be Y, and there's a difference. And I think what I've seen that as well too. Some people have asked us, say, well, we thought vulnerability would be higher, a better ROI and then a lower ROI. Why are we not seeing these risks align the way we expect us? I think one of the biggest things that I'm a big driver of is data-driven CRQ, because it helps remove some of the new F word I found. And the new F word in my world is feel, because people feel like numbers should be what they want. And I don't really care what they feel like numbers should be. Numbers tend to not lie. But anyway, I'm with you 100% on that one.
I think that wins the webinar right there.
I was going to say, I think that we've proven that we could definitely talk about this all day and continue this CRQ conversation. I do want to just, and I see there is a few more questions. Apologies if we haven't got to yours, but we really could be here until tomorrow if you guys want. But we'll just address one more and take the other ones offline. I think this one might be of interest to a few people, and we've still got a good number of people on. So just finally, a few minutes on any recommendation, any recommended resources for reference of automations or integrated efficiencies via integrating FAIR with GRC or other risk management solutions. I can reread the question if it will help.
That's a great question. I mean, I think the question kind of touched on automation, but also with GRCs. To me, I think this, when you think about what you want to do from a risk assessment perspective, what we see people doing is they're using GRCs to kick off a process to assess risk on an entity or an asset. So if you think about it, the business problem is, I want to assess the risk of something that affects my business. The GRCs we see, pick your big GRC, tend to be the container, the source of that. And so from lots of different ways to answer that question, I'll tell you what I'm seeing. I'm seeing people go, when I kick off a workflow in the GRC, assess the risk financially and then feed that data back to the GRC, because the GRCs tend to be the one source for all that data and for the results. But I'm not sure where that question is exactly going. That's just what I'm seeing people do in using tools to help with. Wade, I don't know if there's another way to answer that question.
I mean, that was going to be my answer to the marrying up of controls and what we have and those kinds of things is often imported from GRC tools. As far as other integrations and things like that, I honestly am not sure.
Lovely. Well, I think hopefully I speak for the whole audience when I say this, but this has been an absolutely great discussion, clearly very thought-provoking, and apologies to anyone's questions we didn't get to. We really will take this offline. But please do feel free to, connect with us on LinkedIn. Please feel free to send in your questions, via our websites. That's absolutely fine. And we'd love to hear from everyone about what they thought of today's session, and as I said, what you'd like to hear more of in the future. So if you do have a minute or two, please do fill in the feedback. And if there's anything in particular you want to continue the discussion on, we'd be happy to follow up with you. So do please take a few moments to fill that in. But on that note, thank you everybody for joining. And thank you to our two speakers, Jerry and Wade. You've been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks.
And brilliant. Thank you so much. And hopefully we'll see you again very soon for our RQ 6.0 webinar on the 23rd of November. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Take care. Bye-bye.